In 1940, the average Briton was rationed to 2 ounces of butter and a single egg a week. That same year, Winston Churchill was drinking a bottle of champagne a day. While London burned and families queued for scraps, the man running the war ate like a Victorian emperor. Number 14 on this list was shipped across an ocean at the height of a naval blockade. Number 3, he called his medicine and sipped it from breakfast until midnight. And number 1, he loved it so much, he named a racehorse after it. These 20 foods and drinks kept Churchill going through the darkest years in British history. Hit that subscribe button and let us count them down. Number 20, clear turtle soup. Almost every dinner Churchill sat down to during the war began the same way, with a bowl of clear soup so thin you could read a newspaper through it. He hated thick soup. He wanted consomme, ideally clear turtle soup, simmered for the better part of a day from real turtle meat, sherry, and bone, then strained again and again until it ran like amber glass. In a country where housewives were stretching a single stock cube across a week of watery broth, Churchill's kitchen was reducing gallons of rich stock down to a few gleaming spoonfuls. Tinned clear turtle soup was still sold to the wealthy through the entire war. It was the taste of a vanished Edwardian world, and he insisted on starting nearly every meal with it, even on nights when the bombs were falling on the city outside. Number 19, Stilton cheese. The ordinary British family was allowed 2 ounces of cheese a week, sometimes less, usually a hard, rubbery ration cheese engineered for shelf life rather than flavor. Churchill ate Stilton, the king of English blue cheese, veined blue-green and crumbling, aged for months until it turned sharp and creamy at once. He liked it served the traditional way, a whole wheel with the top cut off, the center scooped out with a spoon, and vintage port poured straight into the hollow to soak the cheese from within. A single wheel of proper Stilton held more cheese than a working family saw in half a year. He ate it at the end of dinner while cabinet ministers waited, taking his time, letting the port and the blue cheese blur together on a silver spoon. Number 18, Dover sole. Fish was never officially rationed in Britain, but it was scarce, dangerous to catch, and often unaffordable, since fishing boats were being sunk and requisitioned for the war. Churchill ate Dover sole, the most prized flatfish in British waters, delicate, firm, and expensive even in peacetime. His cook would fillet it, dust it in flour, and fry it gently in butter, another item most families barely had until the edges turned gold and the flesh flaked into snowy sheets. A single Dover sole could cost more than a laborer earned in a day. He ate it plainly, the way the English aristocracy always had, with nothing but butter, lemon, and a little parsley, believing that the finest fish needed no disguise. It was a quiet, enormous luxury on a wartime plate. Number 17, roast sirloin of beef. The meat ration was pinned to a value of roughly 1 shilling and 2pence a week, which bought most families a small, tough, fatty cut they had to nurse across several dinners. Churchill ate roast sirloin of beef, the great English Sunday joint, a huge rib of beef roasted rare with the fat crisped and the center still pink and bleeding. It was carved at the table in thick slices and served with Yorkshire pudding puffed up in beef dripping. A joint like this could feed a dozen people, and it appeared on his table when most of the country had not tasted a proper roast in months. He loved it bloody. He would send it back if it came out gray and overdone, in a country where a scrap of gristle was treated like treasure. Number 16, French petit fours. Churchill had a serious sweet tooth, and his kitchen was run for years by Georgina Landemer, a cook trained in classic French technique who had worked in some of the grandest houses in Europe. She made him petit fours, tiny jewel-like pastries iced in pastel colors, filled with almond paste, coffee cream, and chocolate ganache. Each one was barely 2 bites, glazed by hand, and set out on silver in neat rows. The nation's sugar ration was 8 ounces a week, and children were saving their sweet coupons for a single bar of chocolate a month. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister was finishing state dinners with trays of delicate French confectionery that took hours to make. He ate them with coffee, popping them one after another while he talked, a small daily rebellion against austerity that most Britons never even knew was happening. Number 15, ice cream. Of all the treats on this list, ice cream may have been the one Churchill loved most childishly. He adored it, and he ate it often, even as commercial ice cream was effectively banned for ordinary people. The government prohibited the manufacture of ice cream in 1942 to save milk, sugar, and fuel. So for most of the war, the average British child could not buy a cone anywhere. Churchill's kitchen made it fresh with real cream, egg yolks, and sugar, churned by hand into something dense and rich. He liked it simple, vanilla, or with a little fruit. Picture that contrast for a moment. A whole country of children forbidden from tasting ice cream for years, and the man who signed the order eating bowls of it at his own table whenever he pleased. Number 14. Fresh peaches. Here is one that seems almost impossible for wartime Britain. Fresh peaches, soft, fragrant, dripping with juice, arrived on Churchill's table even at the height of the U-boat blockade, when imported fruit had all but vanished from the shops. Most British children went the entire war without seeing a banana or an orange, let alone a peach. Some were grown under glass in the heated hothouses of great English estates, a Victorian luxury that survived the war for those who could afford the coal. Others were flown or shipped in as gifts from allies and admirers. Churchill liked them peeled and served with cream, or sliced into a glass of champagne so the bubbles carried the perfume of the fruit. In a nation living on turnips and powdered egg, a ripe peach was almost a fantasy. He ate them like they were ordinary. First pattern break. Here is where you have to stop and really see the gap. While Churchill was eating peaches and ice cream, this is what the rest of Britain was living on. 2 ounces of butter a week, about 4 thin scrapes on toast. 1 fresh egg, if you were lucky, sometimes replaced by a spoonful of yellowish powder mixed with water. 2 ounces of tea, 4 of bacon, a sliver of cheese, and a meat allowance so small that offal, sausages patted out with bread, and whale meat became normal dinners. Bread was gray and heavy. Onions became so rare they were raffled as prizes. Children grew up not knowing what a lemon tasted like. Whole cookbooks were written about disguising the same 3 vegetables. This was not a brief shortage. It was 6 years of it, and it stretched on into the 1950s after the war was already won. Number 13. Roast grouse and game birds. When the shooting season opened, Churchill ate the way English country lords had eaten for centuries. Roast grouse, that dark, gamey, heather-fed bird considered the finest game in Britain, appeared on his table alongside partridge and pheasant. Game was one of the great loopholes of wartime eating. It was not rationed because you could not easily control it, so those with access to great estates and shooting parties kept eating it while the cities went hungry. The birds were roasted quickly to keep the flesh rare, served on fried bread with a rich gravy made from their own juices. A brace of grouse from a Scottish moor was a rare and expensive thing. Churchill, moving between grand houses and Chequers, the Prime Minister's country estate, had steady access to a world of food most Britons only read about in old novels. Number 12. Lobster. Shellfish, like whitefish, escaped formal rationing, but lobster was rare, costly, and difficult to get during the war, when boats and men had been pulled away for the fighting. Churchill ate it anyway. It came to the table split and grilled, or dressed cold with mayonnaise made from real eggs and oil, both of which were precious. The sweet, firm meat was pulled from the shell and served on ice, a cold luxury from a warm dining room while the sirens sounded outside. There is a particular strangeness to imagining the leader of a besieged island, a country being starved by submarine warfare, cracking lobster claws at dinner. But that was the reality. The sea that was killing British sailors was also, on certain nights, delivering lobster to the Prime Minister's plate. Number 11. Smoked salmon. Long before it became a supermarket staple, smoked salmon was a genuine delicacy, and it was one of Churchill's favorites. Wild Scottish salmon, cured in salt and cold smoked over oak until the flesh turned deep coral and silky, was sliced paper thin and served with lemon and brown bread. Fresh butter went on the bread, of course, in a country where butter was gold. Salmon runs still came up the Scottish rivers during the war, and the fish was smoked the old way in small Highland smokehouses. On Churchill's table it was a starter, something to open the appetite before the soup and the beef and the pudding still to come. For the ordinary family, a slice of good smoked salmon was the kind of thing you might taste once at a wedding, if at all. For him, it was a Tuesday. Number 10. Oysters. Churchill loved oysters, and he did not eat them 1 or 2 at a time. He ate them by the dozen. Native British oysters, cold, briny, and metallic, slipped straight from the shell, sometimes eaten as an entire meal on their own. Oysters had once been poor man's food in Britain, so cheap that they were stuffed into pies to stretch the meat. But by the war they had become a luxury, the beds depleted and the labor gone. Churchill kept eating them, opening dozens at a sitting, chasing them with a glass of chilled white wine or champagne. There is something almost defiant about a man swallowing oyster after oyster while his country rationed the very fish in the sea. He treated them as a birthright, a taste of the older, richer England he was fighting to preserve. Number 9. Beluga caviar. This one came with a story attached. Churchill ate caviar during the war, the real thing, glistening gray-black beluga sturgeon roe from the Caspian Sea, and some of it arrived as a personal gift from Joseph Stalin himself. As the two men negotiated the fate of the world, the Soviet leader sent tins of the finest Russian caviar to London as a gesture between allies. Churchill spooned it onto toast or ate it plain, the little pearls popping with a salty, buttery richness that cost more per ounce than almost any food on Earth. Think about that supply line for a moment. At the darkest point of the war, caviar was crossing thousands of miles of contested territory to reach the Prime Minister's dinner table. Food was never just food at that level. It was diplomacy, flattery, and power, all served on a silver spoon. Second pattern break. So was it hypocrisy? That is the question people always come back to. The country was starving, and its leader was eating like a king. But Churchill genuinely believed his food and drink were not indulgences. They were fuel for the machine that was winning the war. He worked 18-hour days, dictated through the night, ran the entire war effort from his bed and his bath, and refused to let his routine bend for anyone. He was convinced that fine food and steady drink kept his mind sharp and his spirits up when the news was at its worst. His doctors mostly agreed, or at least gave up arguing. And here is the uncomfortable truth. It may have worked. The man was in his late 60s, overweight and sleeping 4 hours a night, and he outlasted nearly everyone. Right or wrong, he never once apologized for a single bite. Number 8. Cheese soufflé. Georgina Landemer's French training showed most in the dishes that were nearly impossible to make on rationed ingredients, and the cheese soufflé was the crown of them. A proper soufflé needs eggs, butter, cheese, and milk. 4 of the most tightly rationed foods in the entire country, all whipped together and baked so precisely that it rises into a trembling golden crown that collapses if you so much as slam a door. To make one during the war was to pour a family's weekly ration into a single dish that had to be eaten the instant it left the oven. Churchill ate them as a savory course, light as air, rich as sin. Every soufflé that came out of his kitchen represented an almost obscene concentration of scarce ingredients, conjured into a dish that existed for barely 5 minutes before it fell. Number 7. Roast chicken and capon. It sounds ordinary now, but in wartime Britain a whole roast chicken was a rare and celebrated thing. Chickens were worth more alive for their eggs, so killing one for the pot was a genuine sacrifice most families made only at Christmas, if then. Churchill ate roast chicken regularly, and better still, capon, a specially fattened bird prized for its heavy, tender, almost buttery meat. Roasted until the skin crackled and served with bread sauce and gravy, it was the kind of Sunday dinner most of the country dreamed about. He also loved a rich chicken broth, clear and golden, sipped from a cup. Where a family might get one scrawny boiling fowl a year, his kitchen turned out plump roasted birds as a matter of routine, the smell of roasting chicken filling a house that never went without. Number 6. Boiled beef and carrots. Not everything Churchill ate was exotic. Some of his favorites were the plain, hearty English dishes of his childhood, and he came back to them again and again. Boiled beef and carrots, a great piece of salt beef simmered slowly with carrots and dumplings until it fell apart, was a comfort food he genuinely loved. So was Irish stew, thick with lamb and potato. The difference was always the quantity and the quality. His beef was the good cut, his portions were generous, and there was always more if he wanted it. For most Britons, a full plate of tender boiled beef with real dumplings was a memory of before the war, not a meal they could actually make. He ate these humble dishes the way a rich man eats humble dishes, which is to say, whenever he felt like it, without counting the cost. Number 5. Vintage port. After dinner came the port, and Churchill took his port seriously. He drank vintage port, the deep, sweet, fortified wine of the great Portuguese houses, some of it decades old, laid down long before the war began. It was poured dark and heavy into cut crystal glasses and passed around the table as the cigars came out and the real talk of the evening started. Port was a gentleman's drink, the traditional close to an English dinner, and Churchill treated it as sacred. He paired it with his Stilton, letting the sweet wine and the sharp cheese collide. A single bottle of pre-war vintage port was worth a small fortune, and he had access to cellars full of it. As the country rationed its way through 6 gray years, he was drinking wine that had been resting in bottles since the last war. Number 4. Trifle and rich puddings. The English pudding course was where Churchill's sweet tooth truly ran free, and his kitchen produced showstoppers that would have been unthinkable in a rationed household. Trifle, layered with sponge soaked in sherry, real custard, whipped cream, and fruit, was a mountain of exactly the ingredients Britain no longer had. There were chocolate profiteroles, coffee eclairs, and steamed puddings drowned in cream. Sugar, cream, eggs, chocolate, and alcohol, the 5 things hardest to get, all folded into a single dish. Children across Britain were rationed to 12 ounces of sweets a month and pooling coupons for 1 bar of chocolate. Churchill finished his dinners with towering creamy puddings assembled by a professional French-trained cook. He had loved sweets his whole life, and he was not about to give them up for a war. If anything, he leaned into them harder as the years got darker. Third pattern break. Here is the part that turns the whole story on its head. Food and drink at this level were not just pleasure for Churchill. They were weapons of statecraft. When he sat down with Stalin in Moscow, the 2 men drank and ate late into the night, sizing each other up over caviar and endless toasts of vodka and brandy. And Churchill matched the Soviet leader glass for glass because backing down at the table meant looking weak at the negotiating table. When he met Roosevelt, the shared meals and the flowing wine built a personal bond that shaped the entire Western alliance. Every lavish dinner was a stage. The champagne, the soufflés, the vintage port, they told visiting leaders that Britain was not beaten, not desperate, not on its knees, no matter what the bombers were doing to London. He was eating like an empire that intended to survive. Number 3. Whiskey and soda. Churchill's most constant companion through the entire war was not a meal at all. It was a weak whiskey and soda that he sipped, refreshed, and nursed from mid-morning until the small hours of the night. He drank Johnny Walker, made deliberately weak, more soda than spirit, and he called it his mouthwash. It sat by his side through cabinet meetings, through air raids, through the writing of speeches that would outlive him by a century. He was almost never drunk, but he was almost never entirely without a glass either. It was less a binge than a slow, steady, all-day ritual that ran on for decades. In a country where beer was watered down and spirits were scarce and expensive, Churchill kept a soft golden glass at his elbow at all hours, part habit, part armor, part performance of a man completely unbothered by the chaos around him. Number 2. Brandy. When the whiskey gave way to the late-night hours, Churchill turned to brandy, and he favored fine old cognac from the great French houses. After dinner, with the port finished and the cigars burning, he would settle into a large balloon glass of aged brandy, swirling and warming it as the conversation stretched toward dawn. This was the drink of his most serious hours, the ones spent plotting strategy long after other men had gone to bed. Good cognac, some of it distilled and casked before the war, was another pre-war luxury he refused to ration. He drank it slowly, deliberately, a rich amber spirit that smelled of dried fruit and oak. Combined with the all-day whiskey and the wine at dinner, it was a level of steady consumption that would flatten most people. Churchill simply carried on, dictating, arguing, and deciding the course of the war. Number 1. Pol Roger champagne. Of everything Churchill ate and drank during the war, one thing defined him above all, and it was champagne, specifically Pol Roger. He adored it, and he drank it constantly, reportedly getting through the equivalent of a bottle a day across his long life. Even as German submarines choked the supply lines and champagne became an almost mythical luxury, Churchill kept his flowing. He drank it at lunch, at dinner, in celebration and in defeat. He believed it lifted the spirit and sharpened the mind, and he treated a good vintage as one of the finest things civilization had ever produced. His love for the house of Pol Roger ran so deep that he named one of his racehorses Pol Roger, and after his death, the family created a special cuvée in his honor that still bears his name. While a nation rationed its bread and dreamed of butter, the man who led it to victory toasted the darkest years in human history with a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, utterly, magnificently unashamed. So which one surprises you most? The caviar crossing a war zone, the banned ice cream, or the bottle of champagne a day? Drop it in the comments. I want to know if anyone thinks he earned it, or if the peaches and lobster still don't sit right knowing what everyone else was living on. Because this was not just a man who liked to eat well. This was a leader who decided that surviving the worst years in his country's history meant refusing to live small, even for a day.